I wasn't suspicious. That's the part that still messes with me when I replay everything in my head. I didn't have a gut feeling. I didn't feel tension in the room. I didn't wake up one morning with that sinking sense that something was wrong. If anything, I felt safe. We had been together for 2 years. We lived together. We shared responsibilities, routines, jokes that made no sense to anyone else. Our lives weren't just connected, they were intertwined. She used to tell me I was her safe place. And I believed her. So when people ask me now, didn't you feel it coming? I don't know how to explain that sometimes the most devastating things arrive quietly. No warning. No sirens. Just absence slowly replacing presence. Our relationship wasn't flashy. We weren't the couple constantly posting online or trying to prove anything to the world. We were comfortable, the kind of comfortable that sneaks up on you and convinces you it's permanent. We had routines that felt unbreakable. Sunday mornings meant waking up late, arguing over who made the coffee last time, and scrolling through our phones in silence. Weeknights meant ordering food, even though we said we'd cook. We watched the same shows over and over because they felt familiar. She knew how I liked my eggs. I knew when she needed space without her asking. We had playlists that were basically timelines of our relationship. That kind of intimacy doesn't feel fragile. It feels earned. She wasn't secretive. She didn't guard her phone. She didn't suddenly change her behavior in obvious ways. She still kissed me goodbye. Still said love you. Still asked about my day. That's why I trusted her completely. Trust doesn't come from constant reassurance. It comes from consistency. And she was consistent. Or at least I thought she was. The first shift wasn't dramatic. It was subtle enough to be dismissed. She stopped sharing details. Before, she used to talk endlessly about her day, even boring things. Which coworker annoyed her? What random thought crossed her mind? What she overheard in passing? Then one day, her stories got shorter. How was work? Fine. What did you do today? Nothing special. At first, I didn't think twice. People get tired. Life gets repetitive. Not every day deserves a breakdown. But something about the way she said it felt closed. Like a door gently shutting. I noticed I was the one filling the space more often. Talking longer. Asking more questions. Trying harder to keep conversations alive. And I hated myself for noticing. Because once you start noticing, you start questioning yourself. Am I being needy? Am I overthinking this? Am I creating problems where there aren't any? So I did what a lot of people do. I stayed quiet. I convinced myself love didn't need constant maintenance. That relationships go through phases. That this would pass. I didn't realize silence doesn't protect love. It just gives distance room to grow. She started falling asleep faster. Not in a comforting way, but like she was already exhausted before she even got home. She'd turn away slightly. Not completely. Just enough to feel it. I remember lying there one night, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathe, thinking, when did I start feeling lonely next to the person I love? That thought scared me. So I pushed it away. People always say, why didn't you just talk to her? Because asking questions felt dangerous. Questions risk answers. And answers risk change. And I wasn't ready for change. I thought stability meant endurance. I thought love meant patience. I thought if I stayed calm and supportive, everything would settle back into place. I didn't know I was already being left. The hardest part isn't the betrayal. It's realizing how normal everything felt right before it fell apart. We laughed. We made plans. We talked about the future. And somewhere inside all that normalcy, something important was slipping away. Quietly, the first time I heard his name, it didn't mean anything. That's important. Because if it had felt wrong immediately, I might have reacted differently. I might have paid attention sooner. I might have trusted myself instead of dismissing the feeling. But it didn't feel wrong. It felt normal. We were cooking dinner together, nothing fancy. One of those evenings where we stood in the kitchen half talking, half existing. She was chopping vegetables. I was leaning against the counter, scrolling on my phone. She laughed suddenly. "Mark from work said something ridiculous today," she said. I looked up and smiled automatically. "What did he say?" She told me the story. It wasn't particularly funny, not memorable, just a story. I nodded, reacted the way you do when your partner talks about a coworker. Because that's all he was. A coworker. People talk about coworkers all the time. I talked about mine. She talked about hers. There was no reason to feel threatened by a name I didn't know attached to a person I'd never met. And that's what makes emotional replacement so dangerous. It doesn't arrive as a threat. It arrives as background noise. A few days later, his name came up again. Then again the following week. Not dramatically, not excessively. Just consistently. "Mark agrees with you about that. Mark noticed the same thing. Mark actually went through something similar." Each time it felt harmless. But something subtle shifted. She talked about him with interest. Not admiration. Not attraction. Interest. The kind of interest you have when someone understands you. And that's when I should have paid attention. What I didn't realize right away was this. The energy she used when talking about him was energy she no longer used with me. When she talked about me, it was comfortable. Routine. Assumed. When she talked about him, there was curiosity. And curiosity is the beginning of distance. One night after hearing his name again, I joked casually. "Wow, Mark sounds important." I said it lightly. I smiled when I said it. I didn't accuse. She laughed. But her laugh didn't reach her eyes. It was quick. Controlled. Like she wanted the moment to disappear. And suddenly, I felt like I'd stepped on something fragile without realizing it was there. That was the first moment fear showed up. Not panic. Not jealousy. Fear. Because fear doesn't shout. It whispers. It says, "Pay attention. Something has changed." And instead of listening to it, I dismissed it. After that night, I found myself trying harder without consciously deciding to. I listened more closely. I laughed louder at her jokes. I made more effort to be present. Not because she asked, but because something in me sensed I was losing ground. And the scariest part, she didn't notice. Because when someone starts drifting, they don't feel the distance they create. Only the person left behind does. I started noticing how conversations ended differently. I'd talk about my day. She'd listen politely. She'd talk about her day. I'd listen fully. But when it came to us, to feelings, to connection, to deeper conversations, she seemed tired. Not exhausted. Just uninterested. And that hurt more than anger ever could. There was one night I almost asked her directly. We were lying in bed, lights off, facing the same direction. I stared at the wall and felt the words forming. "Is everything okay with us?" But I swallowed them. Because what if she said yes? And I was just insecure. Or worse, what if she hesitated? I wasn't ready for either answer. So I stayed quiet. Looking back now, this is the part that hurts the most. Not that she found comfort in someone else, but that my silence created space for it. Not because I did anything wrong, but because love needs presence, and absence doesn't stay empty. From that point on, something changed permanently. Not visibly, not dramatically, but internally. I started watching instead of participating, listening instead of sharing, waiting instead of feeling chosen. And without realizing it, I had become a background character in my own relationship. At the time, I still believed I was fighting for us. I didn't know she was already building something parallel. Something quieter, easier, less complicated. Something that didn't require confronting what we were losing. There's a moment in some relationships where you stop feeling at home. Not because anyone tells you to leave. Not because there's a fight. But because the space no longer feels like it belongs to you. That's what happened next. And it didn't happen all at once. Everything around us looked normal. The couch was still there. The photos on the wall hadn't moved. Our shoes were still lined up by the door. But I felt like I was visiting my own life. She moved through the apartment differently, more self-contained, more inward, like she was carrying conversations that didn't include me. And I couldn't explain why that bothered me so much. Nothing was wrong, but nothing was right either. When I talked, she listened politely. Not distracted, not rude, just distant. She nodded at the right moments, responded when expected, but she didn't lean in anymore. And when someone stops leaning in, you feel it in your bones before you understand it in your mind. She didn't hide her phone. That's the strange part. She didn't angle it away from me or flinch when it buzzed. But she started taking it with her everywhere. Bathroom, kitchen, bedroom, even when she didn't need to. It wasn't secrecy. It was attachment. And attachment always belongs somewhere. I started noticing her smile more. Not when she smiled at me, but when she smiled without me. She'd glance down at her phone and soften in a way she hadn't softened with me in weeks. A small smile. Unconscious. Private. Those smiles hurt more than any argument would have. Because they weren't for me anymore. One night I came home exhausted. I sat beside her on the couch and started talking about something stressful that happened at work. Halfway through my sentence, I realized she wasn't really listening. She wasn't ignoring me. She was just elsewhere. Mentally gone. And I stopped talking mid-thought. She didn't notice. That silence, that unnoticed pause did something to me. I realized then that I could disappear from the room without making a sound. She was still there physically. She still slept beside me. Still shared meals. Still said goodnight. But presence isn't about bodies. It's about attention. And her attention was no longer anchored to us. Without realizing it, I started shrinking. I talked less, asked fewer questions, shared fewer thoughts. Not because I wanted to, but because it felt like my words were landing in empty space. And when your words stop landing, you eventually stop throwing them. I blamed myself constantly. Maybe I was boring. Maybe I was too predictable. Maybe long-term love just naturally loses intensity. I told myself this was normal. That relationships evolve. That passion fades. But deep down, I knew this wasn't fading. It was being redirected. One night, she laughed harder than usual at something on her phone. I asked casually, "What's funny?" She paused just a fraction of a second too long. "Oh, just something Mark said." And there it was. The realization I didn't want to admit. I wasn't just losing her attention. I was competing for it. Because I never agreed to compete. I never signed up to audition for my place in her life. Love isn't supposed to feel like a contest. And yet, without anyone saying it out loud, one had begun. That night after she fell asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My chest felt tight. My thoughts raced quietly. I wasn't angry. I was scared. Scared that something essential was ending, and I was the only one who seemed to feel it. At this point, I still didn't know the truth. I didn't know how far it had gone. I didn't know how long it had been happening. All I knew was this. The person who once chose me every day was now choosing someone else, even if she hadn't admitted it yet. And once that happens, something is already lost. There's a point in every failing relationship where one person realizes something is wrong and decides to fix it alone. That was me. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't announce a plan. I just quietly decided that if love was fading, I would be the one to reignite it. Because that's what you do when you believe in something. I told myself this wasn't the time to withdraw. It wasn't the time to protect my pride. It was the time to show up. I convinced myself that long relationships go through dull phases. That passion needs intention. That comfort sometimes needs reminding. So I started doing the things we used to do. Not desperately. Not dramatically. Just intentionally. I planned a night for us. Not a random dinner. Not a last-minute suggestion. A real evening, the kind we used to value. I cleaned the apartment while she was at work. Not because it was dirty, but because I wanted the space to feel cared for. I cooked her favorite meal. The one she used to request on special occasions. I lit candles. Put on music she loved. Set the table the way she liked it. Nothing extravagant. Just thoughtful. When she came home, she stopped in the doorway. For a second, I felt hopeful. She smiled. She said, "You didn't have to do all this." I told her I wanted to. She hugged me. She thanked me. She meant it. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt like us again. We sat across from each other, eating. I asked about her day. She answered. She asked about mine. I answered. But the conversation stayed on the surface. No depth. No curiosity. It felt like two polite people sharing a meal, not two lives intertwining. And that realization settled heavily in my chest. I kept catching her gaze drifting. Not physically away from me, but inward. Like her thoughts were somewhere else. I wondered if she was texting him earlier. If she was thinking about what she'd tell him later. If she was comparing the two of us without meaning to. That thought hurt more than jealousy. It made me feel replaceable. After dinner, we sat on the couch. I leaned into her. She leaned back just slightly. Not enough to call out. Not enough to accuse. But enough to feel. And in that moment, something in me sank. Because you can't compete with emotional distance by being more present. Presence only works when it's wanted. We went to bed early. She fell asleep quickly. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling again, but this time with a different understanding. I wasn't failing to save us. I was trying to hold onto something that no longer existed in the same form. Effort is beautiful when it's mutual. But when it's one-sided, it turns into exhaustion. And that night, I felt exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider something I'd been avoiding. What if this wasn't a phase? What if this wasn't about effort? What if she wasn't drifting because I stopped trying, but because she had already started choosing someone else? That thought scared me, but it also brought clarity. I still didn't know the full truth. I still didn't know how deep it went, how long it had lasted, how intentional it was. But I knew something important. Love can't be revived by one person alone. And whatever we were holding on to, it was already slipping through my fingers. The thing about denial is that it feels protective. As long as the truth lives only in your head, you can negotiate with it. You can soften it. You can tell yourself you're imagining things. That's what I was doing, until someone else said the words out loud. It was a random afternoon. I ran into a mutual friend, someone who knew both of us well enough to recognize when something was off. We made small talk. Nothing heavy. Nothing intentional. And then she hesitated. That hesitation alone made my stomach tighten. "You didn't hear this from me," she said. I smiled automatically. People always say that before saying something they know will hurt. She's been spending a lot of time with Mark. The sentence wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accusatory. It was factual. I felt my chest go tight, like the air had been pulled out of the room. I nodded, forced a calm reaction, said something like, "Yeah, they work together." But inside, something finally broke. It wasn't jealousy. It was confirmation. Confirmation that what I felt wasn't insecurity. That the distance wasn't imaginary. That I wasn't crazy for noticing the shift. Someone else saw it too. And once the truth exists outside of you, it can't be ignored anymore. I don't remember much about the walk home. Just the weight in my chest. The constant replay of moments I had dismissed. The smiles. The phone. The late nights. Everything suddenly lined up. And I hated how clear it all felt now. That evening I didn't text her. I didn't check in. I didn't ask where she was. I just waited. Not out of suspicion, but because waiting had become my role. She came home later than usual. Not rushed. Not flustered. Calm. Almost peaceful. That calm hurt more than guilt would have. As she moved around the apartment, I saw her differently. Not as someone confused. Not as someone struggling. But as someone who had already made emotional decisions, even if she hadn't admitted them yet. And for the first time, I felt something solid settle in my chest. Not anger. Clarity. I wanted to ask her everything. Where she'd been. What they talked about. How long this had been happening. But I didn't. Because I realized something important. Answers wouldn't bring her back. They would only give me details to obsess over. And I didn't want to carry that weight. That night lying beside her, I stopped planning. No more surprise dinners. No more silent efforts. No more pretending this was something I could fix alone. I wasn't angry. I was done negotiating with uncertainty. I didn't confront her yet. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed to be sure of one thing. Was she choosing him? Or was she just afraid to choose anything? I needed to know. And I knew the only way to find out was to ask the one question that couldn't be avoided. I didn't confront her immediately. I didn't accuse. I didn't yell. I didn't demand explanations. Because confrontation without clarity is chaos. And I needed clarity more than drama. So I asked a simple question, the one that would decide everything. It was a quiet evening. The room smelled faintly of the dinner I had made days before, the one she hadn't seemed to care about. We sat together on the couch, side by side, not touching, just existing. I turned to her and asked, "Are you still happy with me?" It wasn't sharp. It wasn't accusatory. It was gentle, and the weight of it hung between us like a stone. She froze, not defensive, not surprised, just frozen. I didn't push. I didn't speak. I just waited, because sometimes silence is louder than words. It tells you everything you need to know if you're willing to listen. And I listened. Finally, she spoke. I don't know anymore," she said. Her voice was soft, almost fragile. She admitted she had feelings for him. She swore nothing physical had happened. She said she was confused. But confusion doesn't erase what's already shifted. And deep down, I realized this wasn't about betrayal. It was about choice. All the late nights, the distracted smiles, the energy she gave to someone else. It wasn't imagined. It wasn't my insecurity. She had started choosing someone else, emotionally, if not physically. And that's the kind of hurt that's slow and quiet, but heavier than any shouting match. In that moment, I realized I had a choice too. I could fight. I could beg. I could stay and hope she remembered us. Or I could walk away. Quietly, calmly, without hate. Because love isn't about clinging to someone who isn't fully there. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply said, "I love you, but I won't stay where I'm no longer chosen." She cried. She apologized. She promised nothing like this would happen again. And I believed her for a split second. Then I walked out. That night, I packed the things I cared about. Not everything, just the essentials. I left her the apartment. I left her memories we had made. I left her the possibility of choosing differently. But I didn't leave my dignity. I didn't leave my self-respect. I didn't leave the certainty that I had made the strongest choice I could. It hurt, more than I expected, more than any imagined betrayal, more than nights lying awake alone. Because leaving someone you love isn't about anger. It's about letting go. And letting go hurts. When I closed the door behind me, I realized something I hadn't known I needed. I was free. Not free from heartbreak. Not free from sadness. But free from a love that had already begun to drift away. And that freedom, quiet as it was, felt stronger than staying ever could. The apartment was quiet. The smell of her perfume lingered faintly in the air, but it was no longer ours. The bed felt emptier, not just physically but emotionally. I walked through the space one last time before leaving. Every object, the photos, the mugs, the blankets we shared held memories. And every memory reminded me of what I had lost, what I had chosen, and what I needed to survive. The first few days were strange. Not chaotic, not dramatic, just empty. I didn't know what to do with myself. My mornings were quieter. My nights were longer. My phone, which had once been filled with her messages, now sat silently. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to hear her voice. I wanted to convince myself that maybe we could go back. But the truth sat heavy in my chest. We couldn't go back. Because the moment she started choosing someone else, our story had already changed. There were moments of doubt. Moments where I wondered if I had overreacted. Moments where I missed her laughter, her touch, her presence in ways that felt almost unbearable. I replayed the good times. The shared playlists. The inside jokes. The Sunday mornings in bed. And then I remembered the late nights. The distracted smiles. The conversations that ended mid-thought. The distance that grew without warning. And I realized, missing her didn't mean she belonged in my life anymore. One of the hardest lessons I learned in the aftermath was this: being alone isn't the same as being lonely. I began to reclaim parts of myself that had been quieted over the years. Hobbies I had abandoned, friends I had neglected, dreams I had postponed to accommodate us. I learned to enjoy my own company, to feel complete without someone else defining my worth, to laugh, eat, sleep, and wake up with only my own heartbeat as the rhythm of my life. And strangely, that made the heartbreak easier to bear. Weeks passed, months passed, and one day I realized I had smiled genuinely. Not out of habit, not out of obligation, not because I was pretending everything was okay. It was real. The smile didn't erase the past. It didn't diminish the pain. It was simply proof that life continues, that hope still exists even after betrayal, that I could love again, not her, but life itself. I spent a long time reflecting on why it hurt so much and why I didn't leave sooner. It wasn't the infidelity that broke me. It was the slow unraveling, the feeling of being replaced emotionally before it ever became physical. It was realizing that I had been investing fully while she was quietly redirecting her heart. And that's when I understood a hard truth. Love cannot be sustained by one person alone. And respect, self-respect, emotional respect must come first. Walking away quietly was the hardest thing I've ever done. No arguments, no dramatic confrontations, no shouting or blame, just dignity, just certainty, just knowing that I would not participate in a story where I was no longer wanted. And that quiet choice, the hardest one, became the strongest, because it taught me something crucial. Sometimes the right choice doesn't feel good at first. Sometimes it hurts more to stay than to leave. Sometimes letting go is the bravest act of love you can perform, not for someone else, but for yourself. Life didn't magically become perfect. There were still moments of sadness. There were still times I questioned if I did the right thing. But slowly, clarity replaced confusion. I discovered the joy of mornings without tension, the peace of evenings without worry, the calm of a mind no longer tethered to uncertainty. And in that calm, I rebuilt myself. Now when people ask me, "Did you regret waiting? Did you regret leaving quietly?" I tell them the truth. No. I walked away not because I didn't love her, but because I loved myself enough to choose certainty over doubt. I left not because she betrayed me, but because staying would have betrayed the life I deserved. And I learned that sometimes the strongest love is the love you give yourself, even when it hurts more than anything else. And so I leave you with this, because it's the question I still ask myself. If you were in my place, would you fight for someone who no longer chooses you? Or would you walk away quietly and give yourself the chance to be whole again?